Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of Home Education Matters. And today I'm joined by Helen James, and we are going to be talking all things economics. And when I say all things economics, that doesn't mean we are going to be piecing our way through the Conservative Party budget. We're not going to be doing any of that. We're just going to be talking about how your child can study economics at home, and with an eye to the GCSEs or the sort of options when it comes to taking an exam. So Helen, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today. And do tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into tutoring sort of within the home education sector.
Well, I started out as a classroom teacher. So I went to Durham for university to study economics. And then I had a gap year where I was teaching in a rural school in Kenya. So that's sort of what got me into teaching in the first place. So I came back from my gap year and I trained to be a maths teacher, which is not unusual for economics because there's not many economics PGCE courses. So I wanted to stay at Durham, and Durham didn't do economics, so I trained as a maths teacher. My first job was in a girls' school in Surrey as a maths teacher, but whilst I was there, I was given some economics to teach, and then over the years did more and more economics, and then I moved up to the Midlands, where I taught in a boys' school. And then during COVID, when we started with the online teaching, that's when I started doing the tutoring, because I realised that that's something that you could do online and there seemed to be quite a lot of demand for it. And it was when I started doing the tutoring that I was sort of introduced to the home education market and started working with some home ed students. A mixture of economics, GCSE and A-level, but probably a bit more A-level than GCSE.
For home educators?
Yes, yeah.
In actual fact, my son's doing A-levels at the moment, and I feel like there is a growing band of home educated children who are doing A-levels now, where they didn't used to be. It used to be extremely rare for home educated children to do A-levels, but there seems to be a new generation coming through that are doing A-levels at home now.
It's really good to see, actually. And the ones that I've tutored have all been so much more into the kind of what's going on in the world than the kids at school. They seem a lot more interested. They're doing a lot more reading. They know what's going on in the news. They've got really good knowledge of current affairs, and sometimes they know more than I do about sort of the world and what's going on around us. So it's actually really interesting working with the home ed students because they've just got such a wide array of knowledge.
Is that the main difference you notice from teaching in a school to tutoring home ed? Is that the main difference you notice? Is the kind of passion for the subject?
Yes, and I think it's not just for the subject, but it's for other related things as well. They just seem to have more of a hunger for learning, and they take a lot more initiative for their own learning. And I think it means that because they've got a more flexible timetable, they can explore the things that they're most interested in.
In actual fact, I went to Bangor University with my son last week, and I got talking to the admissions officer there, and she said it was actually for the engineering course. They specialise in nuclear engineering, Bangor. It's like a world leader in nuclear engineering. Who knew? I didn't know. But she certainly told me all about it. And when I mentioned that my son was had home educated all the way through and was now self-studying his A-levels, she said to me, no word of a lie, she said, apply now and I'll give him a place. And wow. I said, oh, well, we're going to wait till he gets his results. And she said, I don't care what grades he gets. Apply now and we'll give him an unconditional offer for engineering. I was like, okay. And she said, basically, what we're looking for is students who are really autonomous and able to organise their own learning. Because she said the whole first year university is now trying to teach those kind of skills to students that are coming in.
Yeah,
it's a bit astonishing.
Yes. Yeah. So is he going to apply?
No, he's not. Which is, I know he does want to do engineering, but he doesn't particularly want to go to a British university, although he did really like Bangor. Bangor was really beautiful. But we were actually there for the ocean science course, which is also very, very well known for. Tell us about the economics qualifications. So we're thinking specifically about GCSE. So is there a GCSE or an IGCSE or both, or does it matter, or how does that work?
Right. So there's both, actually. So the 4 main exam boards all have either a GCSE or an IGCSE. So you've got Cambridge, which I think is the most popular amongst home educated students, and that's the IGCSE. And then EdXL have an IGCSE, but they don't seem to have a GCSE. I don't know why. And then you've got AQA with the GCSE and OCR with the GCSE.
Okay, wow. So that is the first time I've done quite a few of these deep dives into different subjects. That is the first time we've had all exam boards covered. So that's, although actually maths must have had an exam, but I think realistically home educators only really do EdXL IGCSE maths. I've never met a home educator that doesn't do that specification. But you're saying that you've got 2 GCSEs and 2 IGCSEs, but I think you mentioned that most home educators do the Cambridge.
I think so, yeah. That seems to be the popular one.
My son did AQA, so there you are. It just goes to show. Now I've got a small anecdote about economics, which I have actually mentioned really early on in our podcast. So for anyone who's heard this, feel free to eye roll your way through it and go make a cup of tea, because my son loved economics, and as you know, because you actually tutored him for economics for a while, and he absolutely lives, breathes, loves economics. And so we were looking at economics GCSE when he was about 14, and we looked at what I thought was all of the exam specs, except it wasn't, as it happened, AQA. I'd missed that, but I'd done all the others. I did OCR, I did EdXL, and I did Cambridge. And we printed them all off, and he looked at them all, sat them all, and hated them all, just found them really boring, wasn't interested. So we shelved the idea of economics, and he did statistics instead, and that was his first GCSE. So actually he must have been 13. And so we shelved economics and thought, okay, we won't do economics. And then about a year later, it was Christmas. And I said, what would you like for Christmas? He said, I would like this economics textbook, please. And it was just like a really heavyweight university textbook. And I thought to myself, this is really daft. Like, it's really daft that he's not doing economics GCSE. So I had another look and I found the AQA specification. He absolutely loved the AQA specification. He did the GCSE in a very short space of time and got a 9, as far as I recall. And so he really loved the specification that I found for him, which was AQA. Now, I was surprised how much difference there was between the specs. It's a bit like history, isn't it? In as much as they're all really quite different. I found they were quite different specifications. I'm guessing perhaps it's the content is similar, but the way the questions are asked, or is it just purely that they cover different things?
I mean, I've not got so much experience recently. I suppose I've got more experience with Cambridge because I'm an examiner for Cambridge. And last year I tutored a few students for OCR, but I've not had AQA and EdXL for a few years. But I would say they're all fairly similar content. Cambridge tends to be a bit more traditional, especially for the A level. So a lot of things in Cambridge were taken out of the other specifications a few years ago. Things like budget lines and indifference curves, and not in any of the other specifications. They went out years ago, but Cambridge still have them. And then the other examples for A level got globalisation in because that's become a big thing. Whereas Cambridge, I think they've only just brought it in. And I think similar with the GCSE, Cambridge is perhaps a little bit more traditional. But it's more, I think the biggest difference really is the way it's examined.
Okay, so you mean the amount of papers? Okay.
They've all got 2 papers, but it's just how the questions are made up. So, for example, Cambridge, which is what some really like, is one paper is just multiple choice. So it's an hour, 40 marks, multiple choice questions. So if you like multiple choice, then Cambridge is a really good one to go for.
What sort of multiple choice questions are they? Are they sort of data analysis style questions where you're given graphs or charts?
No, not at all. No, just straightforward. I think they're straightforward, but no, some of them will be difficult. But just like you'd get in any exam where it would be sort of which one is not an example of a function of money, for example, or you've got some diagrams. It's like which is the correct shift. So it would be. Sometimes there'd be some quite tricky questions in there, but if you're a good student, could get pretty much full marks on that.
Okay, and so the first paper is multiple choice, and then kind of like terminology, definitions, understanding the pure content. What's the second paper then for the Cambridge?
Second paper That is an hour and a half. And for that one, you have section A, which is where you have your case study. So you'll be familiar with that, where you've got your stuff to read. And then you have some questions on that. So I think you've got something like 2 marks, a couple of 2-mark questions. I think it might be a 4-mark. And then I think you've got a couple of 6-mark questions in there as well. So that's all based upon the extract, the data content that you have to read. And then you've got this final section, which is it's a 6-marker and an 8-marker. And you can choose, I can't remember how many it is, but I think you choose 3 from, they've changed it recently. I think you choose 3 from 4. It used to be, I think it used to be 3 from 6. But you get a choice of questions, but you get your paired, your questions are paired 6 marks and 8 marks.
And these are essay style questions.
Yes, but they're not particularly big. But yes, they're the 6-marker is an explain, and then the 8 is a evaluate, discuss type, for and against type of question.
So would you say that that specification, the Cambridge IGCSE economics, is writing heavy, writing light, or somewhere in the middle?
I would say probably somewhere in the middle, because when you're balancing the multiple choice question, multiple choice whole paper, then yes, somewhere in the middle. But I think that Cambridge is a bit more accessible, especially if you discuss questions, because very much they are just a for and against. For your discuss questions, whereas the other exam boards can be a bit more evaluating, and you've got to criticise your points, and students find that really hard. And so I think home educated students that don't have the same sort of input in the classroom will find those longer questions hard, whereas for Cambridge they are a lot easier. So can't even think of any example questions at the moment, but it would be very much yes. And I think one question that came up, which people would probably be able to answer without doing much economics, is saying evaluate whether older workers are always paid more than younger workers. And then you'd say why older workers are paid more, and then why younger workers might be paid more. So it's a very straightforward kind of for and against kind of question. And if you've learnt your content, it's quite easy. Whereas the other exam boards, the evaluate questions can be very tricky, and even good students will be struggling to get sort of above sort of 3/4 marks unless they've had specific training in how to answer those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say those questions sound quite different to the kind of questions that my son did with AQA. And I'm wondering whether perhaps it's less mathsy, the Cambridge one?
I don't think so. I mean, you'll still have in section A, you'll still have multiple choice calculations. I don't think they tend to have calculations in paper B, sorry, paper 2 rather, but in the paper 1, they'll have the calculations, multiple, the elasticities, that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't think the maths content is really any different across the 4 boards. It's more, I think, for some reason, the Cambridge just seems to be, I just feel like the evaluate questions, the sort of longer questions, seem to be a little bit more obvious what you have to do.
That's interesting, because I've encountered Cambridge with a couple of humanities, and it seems really hit and miss. Like the history, I found the Cambridge really hard, very long-winded, difficult to understand the questions, very hard to get full marks. But the English language, really lovely specification compared to the others. So I think I get the impression with Cambridge that there's a lot of variation between the different subjects, whereas I notice with people like AQA, I always call them multiple choice example, because they always love multiple choice normally. And EdXL is normally they normally have very standard ways of asking and answering the questions regardless of the subject. So talk to me about the maths then for economics generally. Is it what sort of level of maths? Are you talking statistics level of maths, which I would say is a bit lower than GCSE, or is it? Although actually, I don't think that's entirely true now I say that, because my son is doing A-level maths and he uses loads of his statistics GCSE still. So what would you say is the maths level for economics?
For GCSE, and actually probably for A-level, for GCSE, it's working out these things called elasticities of demand, which is where you have to do a percentage change and divide by another percentage change. So that's probably the hardest thing you're going to get, where you do percentage change in price, percentage change in quantity, and you divide them. And that's about as hard as it's going to get maths-wise. For A-level, similar, the same formulas, but you might have to rearrange it a little bit. Whereas GCSE, they wouldn't have you doing any rearranging. But yes, I mean, that's about it in terms of calculations. You might have some total revenue where you multiply price by quantity, but it's just multiplying 2 numbers. There's no kind of there's no difficult maths in it.
So would you say that economics at GCSE level is a science or a humanities?
Very good question. People always say that, if you do maths and economics are a good combination. And then students that are more kind of English, humanities based, kind of worry about economics and say, oh, but it's mathematical. And I always say it's not mathematical itself, but it's a logical subject. And that's why it goes well with maths, because obviously maths is logical and economics is logical, because you're looking at maybe shifting a curve, you're changing something, you then look at the impact of that change, and you've got these logical, well, I think it's logical chains of reasoning that you follow. So I think it's more, if you've got a mathematical brain, then you can be good at understanding economics. But then the other side of it is you might have a mathematical brain, you might be able to understand it, but can you put it in an essay? And that can be at GCSE, tends not to be quite so bad, but certainly at A level you can get some very good mathematicians, further maths, and then it comes to writing an economics essay and they're getting half marks for it. They know the content, but they can't put it into an essay.
Yeah, and I think that is a really common issue with a lot of children in school, is that they tend to get rooted one way or the other quite early on. So, are they sciencey, mathsy? Okay, they go one route. Are they humanities? They go another route. And you don't tend to get that mixing. Whereas I've noticed actually with home educator students, that seems to be a bit less common. And that whilst you do get some that are obviously like super maths brains, you quite often get what I like to call Renaissance children who seem to be quite good at a number of different things.
Yeah.
So what about the role of opinion or critiquing different economic systems, for example? Is there much of that? For example, are there questions like, I don't know, in a utopian future, would you prefer, the Cuban economy or the American economy or whatever? Is there any of that kind of discursive opinion style stuff?
Not really. So you need to know the content, and you might have a case study that you read. For all the exam boards have a case study, and it would be more a case of theoretical, but you might bring in your conclusion, is where you bring in your own opinion, but that it's not a kind of what you think, as in your own political views. It's
facts-based.
Yeah, it's more facts-based. But it's not just learning the textbook. It's important to have knowledge of what is going on around us in terms of the economy.
So it's not so much that there's nuance or interpretation that you need to sort of look at. So, if you're given a graph, you can interpret it multiple ways.
Generally not, no. But what you can do is you might have a question where you're interpreting a graph. So this happened not at GCSE, but at A level, where you're interpreting the graph, and it will be, to what extent does this data illustrate that this is happening? And then you say, well, this is what it's showing. Then you could say, well, however, these are just averages, and it's not illustrating the inequality. So you then would critique it, yes, but not necessarily with your own opinion, just with kind of standard responses that you would often have used for other questions.
It sounds similar in some ways to psychology or sociology, in as much as it's not super mathsy, but similarly it's scientific in as much as you need to use evidence and facts to back up your answer and not opinion. Okay, so if that's Cambridge IGCSE, and that's the one you examine for, but also the one that generally home ed students tend to like, what's the second most popular qualification that you teach?
The one that I've done the second most of is OCR.
That's interesting, because OCR is a kind of niche, exam board in the home ed world. Very few people do an OCR qualification. My son's actually doing OCR physics for A level, and actually his favorite book when he was 9 years old was an OCR textbook for history, as you do. And so OCR is one of those exam boards we don't tend to get exposed to a lot in home education. So tell us about the OCR qualification. Is it much different IGCSE to GCSE, first of all?
They only have the GCSE for OCR. It's in terms of content, I mean, OCR and Cambridge CIE, they're sort of related. So I examined for OCR as well, but I examined the A level for OCR, not the GCSE. But the GCSE for OCR, that's 2 papers. So you have micro for one paper and macro for the other paper. So
Nice. You see already, I like that system.
yeah, so that's
Feels logical.
the downside with Cambridge is obviously you have to learn micro and macro for both papers, which is a lot more in some respects. But then you get 40 multiple choice in one paper. For OCR, you've got two papers, micro and macro, and both of them are set up the same way in that they start off with 20 multiple choice. So you do actually still get your 40 multiple choice, but across two papers. So you've got 20 multiple choice, and then you've got, I think it's 4 questions with different parts to them, might be 5, and you've got like a little extract to read. It's only like 10, generally only like a little, probably a paragraph, and then your questions are based on that paragraph. So you have like a 2, I think you have quite a few 2s, I think there might be a 4, and then you get a 6, and then you have another little extract and you do the same again, and I think you repeat that about 4 times.
So slightly shorter answers than the Cambridge.
Well, the Cambridge goes up to 8 and OCR goes up to 6. So yeah, slightly shorter, but you have more. I think in total you probably end up with this tiny bit more reading, because the Cambridge has got 1 extract, but it's longer, and OCR has got the little ones. So you do a series of questions on each of your little extracts. I think in some ways that's possibly easier because there's less information to take in the extract. So the extract for Cambridge, I would imagine it's probably about 2/3 of a side of A4. Okay. Whereas the OCR ones, they do vary. They put them in a little box, so it's a bit harder to tell, but it would probably take about 2 minutes to read each one.
And how dense are they? Are they, I mean, for example, if you take an example like history or environmental management, they have case studies that tend to be quite lively, because they're quite interesting subjects. And then you maybe have, I know maybe that's my prejudice to show, but then you have things like psychology that tends to be a bit denser, a little bit more sciencey. So what sort of extracts are we talking about? Is it case studies again?
Yes, it would be factual case studies. So this is what has been happening, and this. So I seem to remember there was one about a music shop, and the questions were about what should they be considering when they want to expand into the town next door. And there was a little bit of introduction about the amount of money they made and how many customers they had. So there was a bit of maths in there, but the extracts are not particularly long. Probably a couple of minutes to read.
And how long are the papers?
So for the OCR, it's an hour and a half each paper, and that's
equal weighting.
Yes, equal weighting. That's 80 marks each paper.
Okay.
So the 6-mark questions, you've got some of them that are analysed, so you just explain, and then some of those 6 markers are evaluate, and those OCR 6 markers. Everybody struggles with those. So the students that I've tutored for OCR, they're usually the ones I've tutored actually. All the OCR ones have been from schools, and they have all come to me saying they're getting doing well in the multiple choice, but they get in half marks in the 6-mark questions, and they're the bright students from school get sort of 9s for all their subjects, but they just can't get these 6-mark questions. So they've got a bit more, a bit more of a technique, which is why I think for home ed students they're going to be a lot harder if they're working on their own.
And that's something along the lines of the PE system for history, is it? Where you have to take a point, provide evidence, and then explain how that answers the question. And at the end, you almost do a contrary argument to what you've said.
Yeah, so you might criticise what you've said. So you make your argument and say, well, actually, it might not be this because... and that's the bit that they find harder. Whereas with Cambridge, you're saying, here are the advantages, here are the disadvantages, which is a different style question, and I think it's more accessible.
Okay, that's interesting. And so what about the other IGCSE, which is the EdXL? Because I ask because I think probably EdXL IGCSE across the board is probably one of the most popular home ed choices. If it's available, we tend to like it for some reason. I don't know why. So tell me about the EdXL IGCSE for economics.
So the EdXL, again, it's micro, macro, paper 1, paper 2, 80 marks, an hour and a half, so the same as OCR. But that's set up slightly differently in that it's sort of, you've got a mixture of like, you've got a multiple choice, and you've got like a 2-mark question, then another multiple choice, and it's all a little bit kind of scattered. Different questions. But then within that paper, you've got some 6 markers, some 9, and then a 12.
Wow. So that's a bit more writing heavy.
Yes, I'd say so, yeah.
Does
And
it
then
have less maths to kind of counteract that, or does it have just the same kind of level of maths?
I don't know. You know what? I never really think about how much maths is in there because I like maths, so it's
Yeah.
not something that put me off. I think if I didn't like maths, I'd be going through and groaning every time a maths question came up, and I'd probably notice a little bit more
This
about
is
the
why
level
I
of
ask all the time, you see, because maths
maths.
brings me out in hives.
Whereas I quite like the maths, so I don't really notice. But I think it would all be it'd probably be fairly similar. I mean, I was just having a quick look through a paper before we met, and I saw a few calculations. I thought, oh, they look nice. But I haven't ever gone through the paper and kind of worked out which one's more maths based. I don't think it's going to be that much difference between them. I think what you'll find with Cambridge, if the maths ones are in the multiple choice, you can at least have a go, can't you? And you've got a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right. Whereas for the other exam boards, well, not OCR, whereas with AQA and EdXL, if it's a 2-mark question and you've not got a clue, then you're probably going to end up with nothing.
Does EdXL have no multiple choice then?
So it does have some multiple choice scattered in the first.
Oh, yes, yeah.
But in the paper, it's all a bit kind of just seems to be a bit higgledy-piggledy with a multiple choice and then a 2-mark question, then another 2-mark question, then a multiple choice. It's just seems a bit all over the place. I'm sure there's a logical reason to it.
So far we've got the OCR GCSE that has the least amount of writing but slightly tricky writing. And then we've got the Cambridge, which is kind of medium level amount of writing, and all maths is pretty much the same all across the board. And then we've got EdXL, which seems to have the longest or the highest marked questions,
Yeah.
so the longest. Okay, so what about the AQA? Oh no, before we get onto that, tell me about the EdXL, how that's broken down. So it's micro and macro. Is it 2 equal weighting papers, and how long are they?
Yeah, so they're both an hour and a half, like OCR, and they're both 80 marks as well, so equal weighting.
Okay, so talk to me then about that. The last qualification that we haven't looked at, which is the AQA GCSE.
Well, that's got a 15-mark question in it.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Only one though.
Just the one in each paper. So you do it for micro, you do it for macro. So AQA is 1 hour 45 minutes for each paper. Again, micro, macro. They've got 10 multiple choice at the start. So all the multiple choice are together at the start. And then they've got their other questions, and you've got sort of some little questions like 2s and 3s, and you've got a 6 and a 9 and a 15. I think there's a few 6s in there, 1, 9 and 1, 15.
The 15-mark ones, that's quite a lot of marks, actually. I mean, even for something like history, that's actually really high. So is there a particular style of question that they ask? Is that an evaluative question?
That's evaluate, yes.
So that would be the same kind of structure, that make a point, provide evidence, explain it, and then counter argue, like on the other hand kind of thing.
Yes, yeah, that's right, yes.
Okay, and how does the AQA stack up against the others? I mean, how is it nicely worded? Like, is it, because I know that sometimes Cambridge is often thought of as being, the IGCSEs actually are often thought of as being slightly more simply worded because they're sort of like international GCSEs. How does the AQA stack up against the other 3?
I think they're all right. I don't think there's none of them really stand out as being particularly difficult to understand. Every now and again you'll be going through a paper and I'm not really quite sure what they mean by that because it's strange wording, but I wouldn't say any exam paper in particular has difficult wording. I would say, if anything, Cambridge for A level sometimes words things strange, and I'm thinking to myself, how are international students going to understand this when English isn't their first language?
Yeah, I mean, Cambridge history was like that. I mean, it's so confusingly worded. You'd think all these poor 16-year-olds all around the world where English is their second language trying to understand a Cambridge history exam. So talk to us, carry on.
Yeah, so with Cambridge, it's just some of the questions that I sometimes am not quite sure what they're meaning, and you have to read it a couple of times and think, oh right, okay, I think this is what they're getting at. But yeah, so I think the others, they're all okay in terms of understanding the question.
I think the worry with an exam paper with a couple of these very high mark questions is if you just don't know that one, or if you've not covered it, that's a big drop in marks, isn't it, potentially?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
So talk to us about the A levels then.
So for A level, again, you've got the same 4 options. So Cambridge, AQA, Edexcel, and OCR. Edexcel and AQA are by far the most popular. So most of my students, in fact, I've got 1 OCR student, no Cambridge, and all the rest are Edexcel and AQA, with the majority of those, or I'd probably say 60-50, 60-40 split, Edexcel, AQA.
Are these all just A levels? They're not international
Yes,
A levels?
no internationals. There might, I don't know whether there is an international one. I think it's just the Cambridge one. There might be. Edexcel sometimes have an international. Oh, Edexcel do have an international paper. Yes, I remember now. Yeah, there is an international paper, but I don't know about the Edexcel international paper.
Okay.
I did look at it at one point, but I couldn't recall what it was like.
They're quite new, I think, aren't they? The IALs.
They might be.
I feel like they are. I don't know
Sure.
though. I question myself. I find A levels a whole different ball game when it comes to trying to do them from home. It's really quite complicated. So so the Edexcel is the most popular.
Yes.
Closely followed by the AQA.
Yes. Yeah.
And what's the difference between GCSE economics and A level economics? Is there a big jump? Just like, I mean, most A levels are quite a big jump, aren't they?
Well, I'm actually quite surprised at how much is in the GCSE spec sometimes. I'm thinking they do actually do quite a lot, and I think those that have done GCSE, when they're in school doing if they're in school doing A level, then a lot of the first term they've kind of done it before, and it's maybe just taking it a little bit further. So I think there is, I mean, like with all subjects, there is a jump up to A level, but I think GCSE economics, I think, is not that easy. So I think if you've done GCSE economics and done well at it, then you've got a good chance of doing well at any level.
And so for the A level, what is the main shift between the GCSE and the A level? Is it, that you have to put more of your own opinion in? Is it that you have to critique the data more? Is it more mathsy? What's the main difference, would you say?
I think it's just harder, just a step up, and then obviously when it comes to the exams, you're talking 25 mark questions rather than the sort of 15 as the max. So you've got a lot more. It's a lot more essay writing than.
And these essays would still be quite facts based, would they?
A lot, yes, but they particularly Edexcel their questions for the macro will be they'll ask you a question. They say refer to a developing country of your choice, so they expect you to have done some research on different data for a developing country and to bring that into your answer. So it might be a globalization question. How has globalization impacted developing countries? Refer to one of your choice, and they expect you to bring in a lot more of your own knowledge, not just textbook knowledge, but kind of what's going on in the wider world. And a lot of students in schools don't have a clue. So I could say to them, do you know what interest rates are at the moment? And they're like, they're 2%. No, and they've got no idea. But you kind of you ought to know that kind of thing. And in your essays, you can incorporate things that you might have been reading about, which means this. If you don't have any knowledge other than the textbook, it sometimes makes the essays difficult to answer to a high standard. Because
so there's an assumption at A level that they're really interested in the subject and doing some listening around, reading around, watching around. What about the textbooks? What are if we sort of dial back to the GCSE, the 4 GCSE options, is there one particular textbook that you prefer?
There's not really a great selection of textbooks for GCSE. Sue Grant and Colin Bamford, they're principal examiners for GCSE. I don't know whether Colin's still principal examiner, but they've written a textbook for the Cambridge exam board. So that's the one that I would use. It's very wordy though. OCR, I don't have their actual textbook, but I do have something called My Revision Notes for OCR, which is quite good. It's more of a kind of bullet points than loads and loads of reading.
Is that a book?
Yes, it is. It's a book. I've got it somewhere on the shelf. It's probably about 150 pages, so it's not as if it's like tiny, but it's only like 150 pages, so that's quite good for OCR. But it is very difficult to get resources for GCSE economics. I've got an Edexcel one here, which is Yeah, that's quite decent actually. But again, it's a lot. This is colourful and it's got headings, but it's got questions in it, so it is quite useful. That's 368 pages. That's the EdXL one. And that's, yeah, it's quite good. But with a lot of the textbooks, though, there's a lot of writing, and not a lot. I like to see a bit more bullet points and explanations, whereas it's all, a lot of them, it's all kind of a whole load of stuff on a page and can be difficult to follow.
Yeah, Cambridge textbooks are a little bit that way generally, I think, aren't they?
Right.
So what about online resources? Are there any online resources you would recommend?
Well, for A level, there's loads, but not really for GCSE, unfortunately.
Do they not choose it in schools? Is that what it is?
Not so much. Most of the students I tutor are A level, and I think that's because schools don't generally, a lot of schools don't do GCSE. I think for GCSE, the only thing online, I'm sure there's other things, but online, there's a website you may have come across with a few other subjects called Easy Education.
No, is it spelled how you would normally spell easy?
Is it
one of these?
Yeah,
it's a modern spelling, is it?
Yes. So EZY Education, and they have it's like online videos and then questions, and they do all the examples for A level, but not Cambridge, and they do OCR for GCSE. So you can subscribe to that. Now, I don't know what the fee is for normal, like if you subscribe as an individual. I think it's quite expensive, but I've got a deal with them, so I can get it for about £20 for a year, which is pretty decent for my students. But if you're signing up individually, it's different. But if you've got a home education group, you could probably get in touch with them and get subscriptions as a package. But they do have other subjects. They've got business studies, I think they've got maths, and I think they've got physics. I'm sure one of my students said they used it for physics. So there might also be chemistry, biology. But with
this
that,
is at GCSE and A level.
Yes, there's a mix. I think some are A level, some are GCSE. Definitely for free. So for economics, it's OCR, but you could use it for the other examples. It's broken down into the OCR specification. So you'll look at the OCR specification, and it'll be, this is the topic, and then there'll be some videos to watch and some questions to answer, and it marks the questions for you. So you could use it for the other exam boards, but you just have to work out which bits you need. But I find it useful for the students I tutor because I can set them work from there. So if we've been doing something like, say, we're doing supply and demand, I can then set them some videos to watch on supply and demand and some questions to do, and then I can check what they're doing. So that's really good. So some schools subscribe to it, and then they do they've worked with some tutors as well, or individually you can subscribe to it as well. But that's quite good. I mean, the videos for economics, they're not always the most exciting, but they do the stuff, they do the job.
Are there any non-specification resources that you would recommend? I know that my son read Freakonomics, like a freak, I don't know, something like that, and I know that there were some economics podcasts that he listened to. Yes. Are there any sort of non-exam based wider learning ones?
Yes, so there's loads of things that you could use for GCSE or for A level. So so Free Economics is a good book, a good sort of starting book. Then there's things like Free Lunch. There's quite a lot of books that you can read. But in terms of free stuff, I listen to loads of podcasts, and they kind of keep you up to date with what's going on. So Wake Up to Money is great. It's like a new daily news program. Planet Money I quite like. It's American, and it's quite entertaining and light-hearted, I would say. So Planet Money, I quite like that one. And then the other one that I like is you probably won't like it. It's but for those that like maths, it's called something like More or Less Behind the Statistics. So it's looking.
I love that program.
Oh, you like it?
Yeah, isn't that strange? Right. Even though I don't like maths, because I like anything that rootles down to the truth behind statistics. So yeah, I do like that program.
So that's really good because it lets you see. So when you're in an essay and you've been given some figures, it helps you learn how to sort of criticize those figures. So if you want to evaluate, you're like, oh, but what about this? What about that? So I love that one. And yeah, so that's probably one of my favorite. But Wake Up to Money is great. Planet Money, I'm sure there's a couple of others that I listen to as well.
What about
But yeah,
YouTube channels? Because I'm aware that most people under the age of 30, apart from my son who loves podcasts, most children under the age of 30, they absorb their content through visuals. So are there any YouTube channels you would recommend?
yes. So again, this is focused on A level, so maybe not quite so helpful, but lots of students really like a chap called Econ plus Dahl.
I'm sorry, what?
Econ plus Dahl.
Econ plus Dahl, as in Taka Dahl.
As in curry dal, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
cool.
But a lot of A level students really worship him, and he's got loads of videos on there. I mean, he is good, but sometimes I think he goes a bit fast, and he doesn't go into he doesn't go down to the nitty gritty like some perhaps say the weaker students might need, and he sort of skips over things that they perhaps might need a little bit more content on. So he's good. And then Tutor to You is probably the main go-to. It's a website, but then they have videos as well. But the videos are more
to you.
Tutor with a number 2 and then the letter U. So I'd say Tutor to You is like the go-to place. You can buy loads of resources there. They do loads of videos. They also do a lot of free webinars. So especially leading up to the exams, they'll do different topics, and you can go sort of join them, and when they've done them, they've just put them on YouTube or put them online on their website, so you can watch them afterwards. So they're really good for free stuff.
So my very last question to you is, are there any general tips that you would recommend for people sitting the economics exam? Are there any sort of like revision tips or tips in how they approach the subject or approach the exams in the subject?
So is this A level or GCSE?
Let's go for GCSE, and you can tell me some A level tips afterwards for that like one person who's doing economics A level as a home educator.
So for GCSE, I think it's about knowing how to answer those longer questions. And knowing the structure for your particular exam board for the longer questions, because you can know all the content, but if you don't know how to answer an 8-mark question or a 6-mark question, then you could end up with 2 or 3 marks for that question. So that's half the marks just totally lost. So I think that's the first thing, is to know how to answer the longer questions. And then I think the other thing is just to practice. I always say, practice multiple choice. You can't necessarily know how well you've done for an 8-marker or a 6-marker. It kind of probably needs a teacher or someone who knows what they're doing to be able to mark it. But if you can practice a multiple choice, you can get instant feedback, because the mark schemes are there for you to see the answers to the multiple choice, and you can know. And if you can do the multiple choice, they can often be quite tricky, and it really gets you thinking. So multiple choice is good revision for everything. Even though you might not get many multiple choice questions in your exam, it's still good revision for everything else, and you get instant feedback about whether you're understanding it.
I think they're really helpful tips, and I know that my son, who, as I say, loved economics, I brought Helen in as a tutor at the very last minute, really, for my son, for just before he sat his GCSE economics, just to help him out with that exam technique, just because it is different. You can know the stuff, but getting it down into an 8-mark question or even a 15-mark question, I mean, that's that it's a whole different art form, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, so for any of our listeners who may want to find you and see what you're up to and see what you offer, do let us know your website links and social media links.
So my website is hjeconomicstutor.com, I think. And my Facebook, I think if you search for economics tutor, I think you should find me, but I think there's quite a few other people that call themselves economics tutor. So probably the best way to find my Facebook is to go to my website, and the link is there. And then I am on Instagram, but when I post anything on Facebook, it just automatically goes to Instagram. So it's exactly the same on Facebook as Instagram. So on Facebook, I just post, if I see something useful in the news, I pop that on Facebook. And it's the sort of things that I'm expecting my students to be reading. So it might be a link to something in the news. So if interest rates have changed, or we've got some figures out for unemployment, just the sort of some of the essential details that students ought to be keeping up with as they study in economics. So I don't post like every day, but it varies. Sometimes I might post 2 or 3 times a week, and then sometimes it might go for a week with nothing. So Facebook is probably the place to see if you want to keep up to date with some of the current affairs.
In my experience, there are 2 types of tutors in the home ed world, and both both have their place, but they are quite distinct. The first type of tutor is the tutor that you pay your hourly money to. They turn up, they deliver the lesson, very good lesson. They may set homework, they may not set homework, they certainly don't mark homework, and then you see them again a week later. And you never get much feedback, you don't hear much from them, but they deliver good lessons. And then you get a second type of tutor who turns up, does good lessons, sets homework, sends emails between the sessions, marks the homework, sends resource tips, sends like, oh, have you seen this program is out this week, that's really helpful, and like gives you loads of feedback. You're definitely the second type of tutor, and I have tutors that land in both camps, and I have great respect for both approaches. But it is very nice to have a tutor that does send you emails saying, oh, have you seen this program's on, and this really relates to unit 3 of this exam spec. And it is really nice, I think, when you have that kind of feedback.
Yeah, so for my tutees, I now have a new system. I use a website called Tutorbird, and I put all the information on there so they can log on, and when I've seen a news article, they can see it there, and I put resources on there as well. So I don't think you've seen that. You may not have seen that.
That sounds very nice.
That's quite useful.
And do you do one-to-one or groups, or how do you, because I know when we first started, you were still teaching, I think, when we first started, but now you're full-time tutoring, yes?
Yes, I think I was still at school. I think it might have been my last year at school, and I've been full-time tutoring for about a year and a half now. So I do one-to-one, and then I do groups. At the moment, I've got one group for year 12 running, and then in the holidays, I do usually do like revision groups during not every holiday, but certainly I did at Christmas, because a lot of students have mocks in January. And then at Easter, I'll be running some classes as well. But mostly it's one-to-one, because that seems to be what the demand is for. So I think a lot of students that want tutoring for economics, it's help with the essays. And you can do that in a group, but you can't get the individual feedback in a group.
That's very true. And I think that I've always been a big fan of one-to-one tutoring, because I feel like it's the most efficient. But actually, as I'm nearing the end now of my home education journey, silent hurrah goes up. And my son was a bit worried about how he was doing with his maths. And we were thinking about whether he was going to do physics at university, and he was a bit unsure about his maths level. And I realized that the reason he's unsure about how good he is at maths is because he's only ever learned on his own. He's either self-studied or he's only had a tutor. And obviously when it's just you and a tutor, they always get it right and you always get it wrong. I mean, that's how it works. Whereas if you're in a group of other students, you're able to gauge yourself against the others. So I sent an email off to his tutor. Turns out he's very good at maths, but he didn't know that because he just sees himself getting things wrong and being corrected. But if he'd been in a group, I think, especially for A level, actually, I think it probably would have been nice if he'd had some group tutoring, because they're able to bounce ideas off each other, and also he would be able to see how other people were getting on with the same subject.
Yeah, and his maths tutor will probably be working on the things that he finds the hardest as well.
That's exactly what the maths tutor said. The maths tutor said, we're doing integration, it's very hard. So, he is going to be finding it hard. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on and guiding us through economics. I am safe to say that it isn't a subject I know a lot about. My son self-studied it with no input from me because I don't know anything about economics, and he would come and sit next to me and give me these long discursive conversations about economic policy around the world, and my eyes would be like slowly shut to me. But I know he very much enjoyed his sessions with you, and thank you so much for talking us through the different specifications.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.